slides. Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Kinsey, and I am joining you from Anchorage, Alaska. Welcome to our daily webinars. With me today is Tiffany Kuehl from Minnesota. I can't promise you that she'll have a Minnesotan accent, but maybe she'll entertain us for just a little bit, and just make me smile with a little bit of an accent. Tiffany is joining us today to talk about recruiting remotely. So Tiffany's been a recruiter for quite some time. I'll let her tell you a little bit about herself before she dives into the content. But before that, let me just get the housekeeping out of the way. Today's session's on recruiting remotely. Tomorrow, I'm going to wrap up our Tech Matters series. You can visit thestrivegroup.com for additional programming or to see this or others on playback. If you're joining us live, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen is our chat function. And we're moderating this while Tiffany is working. So she's got a variety of frequently asked questions that she'll cover in the regular content, but then we'll entertain your questions or your observations throughout. So don't hesitate to type something in there, and I will pop back in to Tiffany and gently interrupt her with that observation or that question. So without further ado, I will let Tiffany take it over. So again, Tiffany, feel free to introduce yourself and let our audience know about how long you've been doing this type of thing.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Heather, and those of you that have joined us. As Heather mentioned, my name is Tiffany Kuehl, and I am based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I've been in recruiting and HR for just over 20 years, coming up on 25 years. Spent the majority of my career, so the last handful of years, specializing in recruiting. In addition to my full-time job, I've also been volunteering with a couple of different organizations, local HR associations, local SHRM chapter, Twin Cities SHRM. I'm currently the past director for Minnesota Society for Human Resources State Council. And I also volunteer with another local organization called 180 Degrees, as well as Recruiters Network, which is the governing board essentially for a variety of local recruiting communities, of which we have one here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So I'm glad to be here to talk with you a little bit about recruiting, specifically with what is going on around us and recruiting remotely, and some of the things that are accessible to us and things that we could or should be doing, or at least considering, given that we don't necessarily have business as usual in a lot of cases. So one of the questions you see here is, how long have we been using long distance or remote tactics to source and recruit? I would say for quite some time. I can't really necessarily put a time frame on it. And the reason I say this is due to the fact that so many organizations do business globally. So not just recruiting individuals from your neighborhood, where your office is located, but recruiting people from different parts of the country or even from other countries. So of course there is the use of the telephone. And then in more recent years, obviously there's the video interviewing that is being done, posting on job boards, which we are probably very familiar with. But when it comes to the sourcing and the screening, a lot of the sourcing and screening, as we know, is done online. So we're using obviously the internet and other tools electronically to do our sourcing, candidate screening. Even as early as late 1990s, early 2000s, we were using things like Skype, and not necessarily even in the office. I know at some point I was partnered with a local Kinko's or FedEx. They had a conference room. We would book that conference room and provide candidates information on how to access that conference room, and then use the technology available to them at that FedEx or Kinko's. So lots of things are kind of evolving from there. Now we have those capabilities technically in-house, and as you're probably aware, we have those virtually from our mobile devices and laptops and home computers now. So we're not, going to the extreme of sending individuals to an offsite location, but we can now do those things right from our home. And most people, I shouldn't say all, but most people do have a mobile device, whether it's some sort of tablet or it's a smartphone with cameras where they can access a lot of the tools and technologies that will enable people to have face-to-face, not necessarily physical, but face-to-face interactions online. So we can use and have used those tools when it comes to sourcing candidates as well as having initial conversations with them. There are platforms, organizations designed specifically or have tools specifically for video interviewing that you can incorporate into your selection process. You can even tack it on to an applicant tracking system if you do have that within your organization. Now, while we do have all of these tools and technologies available to us, there are still individuals that may be reluctant to using them. A lot of us have heard recently about individuals coming into different online meetings without having been invited. So you get bombarded with uninvited guests, or the technology in some way, shape, or form fails. So people are reluctant to use these technologies because they're not used to them. They haven't tried them. They've heard horror stories. And I think what we can do to ease that is with a lot of things that we try or we introduce to an organization, we can pilot something or we can test drive it before we actually buy it and implement it and incorporate it into our program. So that works very well. And if for some reason that tool, that procedure, that process doesn't work, then you try something else.
I think that's an interesting thing. What you're asking, Tiffany, is that our viewers consider patience being a virtue, right? So just because it's new or just because it failed yesterday doesn't mean that it's not a good tool today. So we do have two questions. I think I'm going to specifically hold one of the questions because I'm fairly confident you're going to get to it later. But this question, it might be a good time to ask it now. And that's, what do you do when people are obviously biased against applicants or potential applicants who are reluctant to use technology, or they simply can't figure it out? So what is your advice to help people sort of withhold that judgment that they may have against someone with that reluctance?
Yeah, the HR person in me says it goes back to, are they capable of doing the job? It's not really, depending on the job, it's not necessarily a qualification to be able to do a video interview. So I think what we need to do is be able to provide options. So the video portion or that electronic portion can be an option, but you should have multiple methods for individuals. There may be very specific reasons. You have to be accommodating in the event that you do come across that, where even if it's bias related, or if it's simply that someone doesn't have access to the resource that you're offering, you should be able to provide an alternate method for that person to be considered. Some sourcing and recruiting questions specifically. So some examples of how an employer may engage in sourcing activities in a remote only world. I know even earlier we were talking about how long this has been going on, and the video interviewing, like I said, is not something that's new. It's newer, but it's not something that suddenly sprung to life because we're now faced with more people working remotely. There are, like I mentioned, some screening tools that can be incorporated into your selection process. There are video interviews or video screening tools where once it's implemented, as someone is going through your application process, they are given the opportunity to respond to questions. It could be 2 questions, it could be 3 questions, but these are your pre-screening questions. They respond via a video recording, and they can have 2 to 3 options to record their response. They save those responses, and then those get submitted with their application. So that's one really good way to incorporate some of the virtual components of sourcing. You can also incorporate some videos into your employment branding. So as you are trying to go out and source individuals or identify who you are as an employer and why you're hiring, why it's a great opportunity to work for your organization, include some employee testimonials into your marketing materials. So it could just be something on your site. It could even be part of your job description. So as you post the opportunity on your career site, or if you're posting it elsewhere, maybe LinkedIn, include a brief video to kind of attract people to your organization and give a face to who you are as a business. And as far as incorporating remote recruiting or guiding applicants through the process for completing jobs, I think this is a really key thing, a really key component for your process, because this is going to be or is relatively new to a lot of organizations, and because it's new to a lot of organizations, it will also be new to a lot of your applicants. Provide step-by-step instructions. So if you are directing potential employees or candidates to your website, or you're explaining or showing them your different job opportunities and they want to know how to apply, make sure that you are providing them with step-by-step, click here, click here, click here. Make it as user-friendly as possible, thinking about employer brand, thinking about candidate experience. What is it going to, put your candidate lens on? What is it going to be like to apply for a job for ABC company or for my organization? So making sure that you have explicit instructions as to how to use the technology that you have selected for your recruitment and selection process.
Tiffany, I love that idea. It's almost like a tutorial, how do you apply with us? How do you interview with us? How can you prepare to compete for these jobs? No different than any other sort of multifaceted or multi-stepped process, walking people through it, but do it through videos or tutorials. So I've got a question about
on that note too, I think it's important to provide an estimated amount of time, because of whether government regulations, someone is a government employer, they have multiple questions that they are required to ask that maybe other employers are not. I think it's important in those step-by-step instructions to also state an approximate time frame, so people know how much time to set aside when completing the application.
Oh, that's a very, very good appreciation of the candidate experience, right? So they don't get halfway through it. So I appreciate that too. So the question is about the first part of this slide. So some pragmatic examples about how an employer might engage in the sourcing process. And you had mentioned maybe posting some videos either on your own website or perhaps on social media like LinkedIn or Twitter or something like that. So the question then becomes about workplace privacy. So the question reads, if you're taking videos of folks at the job to show others about the job experience, do you really have to get all that nitty-gritty approval from them to post that video online? And so I know that's kind of a loaded question, and feel free to answer it just in general terms.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good question and one that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it is a very good question, and I don't know the legalities behind it. I'm not an employment law attorney, but think about it from the employee's perspective. I would just be aware that some people are more comfortable than others being on camera, and then in turn being in a video that's going to be seen by others. So my recommendation, just as an HR practitioner, would be to ask for permission to do that, whether it be asking the individual to sign a waiver, or just getting their acknowledgement that yes, that's acceptable. The other thing you're going to want to definitely be aware of is as you are filming, if you are capturing someone in their workspace, that you also keep private some of the confidential information that could be exposed as you're, working in that employee space. Hopefully that answered that question. But the recommendation would be to get their permission, because we don't go to work, most people don't go to work assuming that they're going to be recorded and then displayed for everyone to see. So the next component is screening. So screening does take a lot of time. And the question here, can I explain what processes fall under this umbrella? So screening, in my experience, can be twofold. So the screening piece of the selection process, typically the first component is the review of the credentials. So looking at someone's resume, looking at someone's application, looking at their LinkedIn profile. So looking, quote unquote, on paper, what does this person have to offer? Is what they have on their resume or application in alignment with what we need for the person to do in this role? So that's kind of that preliminary screen, so component one. The second component of screening, in my opinion, is actually having that conversation with an individual. Now, typically that can be done via telephone, it can be done in person, or it can be done via video. So if you're doing a Zoom call, Google Hangout, Skype, whatever, but it's that first component is, do they have on paper what we need? If yes, then let's have a conversation with them. And then during that conversation, you're asking those questions about their experience specifically as it relates to the job you're looking to fill. So candidates can explain to us what it is they've actually done, and kind of dive deeper into some of the things that they have displayed on their resume or have shared on their application. And as far as an employer originating these processes using technology, I think whether or not we're, most of us are working from home, I think we can leverage the use of technology. We can make that candidate experience more enjoyable. We can make it more user friendly. So we can expedite the process by not having to have so many internal face-to-face conversations. We shouldn't be having more than 3 rounds of interviews to begin with. The more you drag it out, the more likely you are to lose a candidate through the process. But what we can do is we can incorporate the screening into the process, doing that via video. We can also do, in lieu of those face-to-face physical interactions, we can do those video conferences for the interviews. We can also use technology for pre-employment onboarding. But before we get to the onboarding, as far as the screening process goes, we can have all of those questions, those preliminary questions, answered prior to bringing someone in to that face-to-face conversation. And then the next component, as we move forward here, is the onboarding. Were there questions, Heather?
There was, and so I heard you say onboarding as I was reading the question. So I'm like, oh, poop, we're advancing. But then you came back to me, so thank you, because there is a question, and it's specifically about the screening. You had said use it for video conferencing, interviews, or whatever. So when nowadays with remote work, obviously, everybody's using WebEx or Zoom or even FaceTime on their smartphones, for that matter, to do screening. But would you recommend, from an employer standpoint or from a recruiter standpoint, to prep the interviewee before such a video conference? Because I can imagine that it's quite intimidating for somebody to not only be using technology when they were all prepared, in their Sunday best to show up in person, but then to have, 6 people and not knowing the communication cues, to use via technology. So the question is it cheating if you help a candidate succeed at a complicated or intimidating video conference? And so once you answer that, I'll definitely advance. But I think it's a great question, and I think it's probably on a lot of people's minds, is how much help do you want to give a candidate?
It is a very good question, and I think it's just good practice to prepare the candidate regardless of the format of the interview. And preparing doesn't mean you're going to give them the questions and or the answers ahead of time. The preparation is all about letting the candidate know what to expect. Again, I always encourage hiring managers and recruiters and HR business partners to put themselves in the candidate's place. Would you want to know what you're going to expect, or do you want to go in blind? So whether it's a video interview or it's a face-to-face interview, you should always be setting that candidate up for success and preparing them for what they can expect. So even if it's you've got a frequently asked questions guide, or if you have an interview prep guide that says, here's what you can expect. If especially now, if there are individuals who've never done a video interview, or even if they have, here's what you'll experience or what you can expect when you log into the video. So it's the login credentials. It's, same as you would for a face-to-face interview. Here's, dress professionally, all of those types of things, but it's not cheating. The cheating component, I think, comes in when you're sitting down with the candidate and you're saying, here's what this manager is going to ask, and here's what the response you should provide is. But if you're basically telling them what they can expect, throughout the interview, as far as who's going to be there, how do you log in, same thing as, here are the directions to our physical location, here's what you do when you walk into the lobby, here's who you should ask for. So I think providing those basic instructions is a good thing, especially when you're considering that candidate experience. Then once you get into the step where you have hired the employee and you're going into onboarding, a lot of organizations right now are not even bringing folks into the office for their onboarding. There are again, technologies and tools that can be used for onboarding. So if you're fortunate enough to have an applicant tracking system or an HRIS or a CRM or ERP or any of those other alphabets, there are modules out there where you can automate your onboarding. So you can do all of that necessary and required paperwork online. And what it does is it picks up where your applicant tracking system leaves off, and then just has the capability of feeding all of that employee data right into your employee file in your HRIS. In instances where you don't have that technology or that capability, you can always send information via mail. So you can do it, you can use FedEx or UPS or whatever your preference is, and make sure that employees have all of the information in a welcome packet, instructions on how to complete the information, what to do with it once it is completed, how to mail it back to ensure that it gets to the right place. So again, it's all about putting yourself in that candidate spot or that new employee spot. So when we talk about strengthening the processes when they're likely to be done remotely, I think it comes down to what may feel like over communicating. So it's touching base. I have a colleague who has even done, in addition to those welcome packets, it's partnering that new hire with someone who is tenured with the organization. So that person, that buddy, or however you want to put it, is connecting and interacting with that individual on a regular basis, checking in and kind of helping them get acclimated to the organization and the organization's culture.
All right, so I do have a question for you, and it's a long one, so I'm gonna just read the whole thing, so bear with me here. It says, what are some ways that recruiters can stay informed on new trends, technology, approaches when things, and I think what the caller means or the viewer means is when technology is changing so fast. So obviously when you first started doing remote recruiting, it was, it was years ago, and you've seen applicant tracking systems become more sophisticated, video conferencing platforms become more sophisticated, and so on and so forth. So how can a recruiter, when he or she is managing probably multiple jobs at the same time, how can he or she balance that and also knowing what technology can bring and sort of what the new trends are?
Yeah, honestly, there isn't a silver bullet to that one. The one thing that the first thing that comes to mind for me is just the networking. So as you're interacting with other recruiters, other HR professionals who have recruiting responsibilities, asking them what they're doing. Social media is another big thing. So if you look at one of the hashtags that may be helpful is hashtag HR Tech. So there are a lot of people out there discussing the different platforms, the pros, the cons, also participating in different online learning events, whether it's a webinar or an online conference. I think but the networking piece, and even if you set aside a little bit of time to do some research, I know when we've got a full rec load and among other things, it's probably not the easiest thing to do. But if it's something that's important and you know that your organization is getting to the point where their technology is outdated and as a result you're not able to attract the right talent, then you've got a business case. So then you need to make the time to do the research.
Sure.
But networking for sure with other HR and recruiting professionals, and then looking to social media, because the people that are out there online on a regular basis seem to be in tune with the different technologies and have a lot of insight and experience.
Right. I know that when we were looking for our applicant tracking system, I don't know if it was luck or if it's the norm, but we had a really, really, really personable and patient sales guy, doing the pitch, so to speak. And we asked him a lot of questions about how might we integrate video? How might we integrate AV? How might we do this? How might we do that? Not because we hire, a buttload of people from all around the world, but because we don't know, right? It's not like Alaska's got a huge labor market just waiting to go to work, right? So we didn't know, but we were just forecasting, and we were really lucky. And that tech person says, well, this is how I would do it and how it would interact with our ATS, and he was quite open about what they were capable of, what was in their future or whatever. But he also had a really, really good, insightful mind and a list of resources, should me and my team want to go out and look. So I do think you're right. And I echo, it takes patience and you have to want to do it, right? You have to want to do the research. But I think that following the HR Tech, I follow that. I read not a lot of blogs anymore, specifically in the HR space, but back when I did recruiting, there are so many fantastic writers out there that are doing the work for us, right? And they're putting it into 800 words or less, so we don't have to spend 8 years, looking for stuff. Right. So that's always helpful too. Anyway, all right. Well, we are coming up on time, so I'm going to just do a little bit of housekeeping again, and then I'll advance to a slide a little bit about Tiffany. So a little bit of housekeeping. One, thank you for joining us today. I know that 30 minutes in your day may be hard to carve out, so I appreciate that you gave it to us. I'd encourage you to visit our website, and if you see some gaps in our schedule or gaps in our programming and you think that we'd benefit our viewers if we offered a specific webinar on a specific topic, just send an email to info@thestrivegroup.com. I will reach out to my network and find someone to design that webinar specifically to address that need. I encourage you to stay positive, and this is definitely uncharted territory for many of us, but none of us are too old to learn, and we just have to want to do it, right? We want to, or we need to want to improve, or learn something new, or get more efficient on something. And the only way to do that is to dive in and try it. And there's no shame in having an absolute failure on something, because then that's just one less thing you don't have to try tomorrow. So I urge you to stay positive. So this is a little bit about my dear friend Tiffany. So I asked Tiffany to give me information about herself, not a resume necessarily, but just some information that would be valuable. And the very first thing she talked about is her son. And so that's the first thing that I'm going to tell you about her. She is a mother to a very funny and curious and insightful and just a terrific young man. No doubt because of the parenting he is getting. She's also a lover of baseball. Anybody that knows her knows that this COVID-19 is really upsetting her because baseball is not happening, not just for her son and for herself, but on a professional level as well. She can't see her beloved twins. So she's, the way I met Tiffany is she was an active volunteer for the Society of Human Resources Management, and she's a speaker in a variety of conferences in the lower 48, and that's how we met. And I would urge you, if you ever have an opportunity to attend one of her sessions, whether it be in person or remotely, I urge you to do so. She has got a valuable brain up there in her noggin, and she is very generous in sharing her knowledge and her insight. So with that being said, Tiffany, do you have any parting thoughts to our viewers today?
The only thing being, my email address is there and my Twitter handle for those of you that tweet. If you have questions, let me know. Just send an email over and I will do my best to provide you with a response.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tiffany, for giving me 30, 35, somewhere around there, minutes of your time. I hope you have a delightful day there in Minnesota. Just so you know, I did not hear any Minnesotan accent in the last 35 minutes. I'm quite disappointed. So now I'm going to have to go to make myself feel better and make a hot dish or something. I don't know what it's going to happen.
There you go. There you go.
Anyway, thank you so much, Tiffany. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.